approaching midnight on the banks of the Severn, and in the space of a few seconds, the flow of the river changes.
So, we got this huge body of water in front of us, yeah? When you consider the force of a tide to turn that body of water immediately, yeah? Within a second.
This is Richard Cook, food producer, fisherman, a riverman, and a proud Severn-sider.
Many fishermen years and years ago, yeah, a lot of them couldn't swim. So they tie themselves with a rope to a tree, because if they were fishing or fell into the river, they at least wouldn't float off, you know. And, you know, floating off could mean, on the push of the tide, you could drop into Gloucester and you get out at Ashelworth, yeah, which is 2 miles upriver, you know.
A lot of power, a lot of energy in this water, yeah.
It's a tremendous force of nature, yeah.
The reason we'd gathered on the banks of the Severn last spring so late at night was what that force of nature was bringing through the river. 2 or 3 years ago, near Bermuda, 4,000 miles away, in the warm waters of the Sargasso Sea, adult eels had gathered to spawn, possibly in their millions. Some of the larvae this produced floated along the Gulf Stream and near Europe's coasts. Their flat, leaf-like bodies began a transformation that turned them into glass eels, or so-called Elvers. It's in this form, transparent and then slightly pigmented, worm-like and wriggling, that they arrive into the Severn, a river with the second highest tidal range in the world.
If I was a glass seal and I drifted across the North Atlantic on the North Atlantic Drift, and I was making my way to the British waters, and I got up through this English Channel and I see this huge tide coming in on the Severn, pushing me in, I'd jump on that free ride, yeah? I'd be the first on that tide to say, wow, it's taken me 2 years and I'm going to get this free lift now up to where I eventually want to end up. So these glass eels, they jump on these big tides. There's tides on the Wye, there's tides on the Severn, tides on the Avon, there's tides on the Parrot, yeah. So they're jumping on these tides and they're catching these free rides up the rivers, yeah, to where they want to get to, so as they can develop into eels later in life, yeah.
And where are they trying to get to?
So as the fish come into the river, they're looking to get to ditches, ponds, dikes, headwaters. They want to get out of this main brackish flux of water into fresh water, yeah, where they then can start to, as the water warms up, they start to feed and develop into eels with their black backs and silver bellies.
As the juveniles move beside the riverbank, there are fishermen, such as Dave, another Severn-sider, waiting with the rectangular nets ready to lift the glass eels out of the water.
So what I'm doing there is I'm just dipping my net, waiting for a few minutes and then lifting them out, because the tide's running back out now. They caught a free ride up, now it's going back out, it's too strong from out there, so they drift into the sides. So that's when we start catching them now. Yeah.
Are they on the surface of the water?
Yeah, they won't be very deep. They only tend to go deep when you get a cold air on top of the water, you know.
It's a beautiful place to be, isn't it, Dave?
Look at it.
Full moon.
Yeah, it's
moonlight on the water.
Yeah,
trees around us.
Yeah, it's just magical.
The glass eels that manage to avoid the fishers' nets and make it through the weirs along the river can spend a decade or more in the freshwater habitats that span out from the estuary, feeding, growing, waiting to make an epic return back to the Sargasso Sea. And for millennia, this annual rhythm of the Elvers' spring arrival has been an important food story.
It's a tremendous migratory journey, yeah.
Possibly one of the most dramatic.
It would appear that everything's stacked against them. Our interest, my family's interest, and the fishermen before, and the people of Gloucestershire, or Severn-siders really, the people that live along the river. The arrival of the glass eel, when you talk about hundreds of years ago, it was actually an important source of protein. So it was actually considered a poor man's fish. So the salmon and the sea trout was owned by the aristocracy, by the crown, and the glass eel was owned by the poor. So it was a poor man's fish to catch in the spring of the year, and it was actually a breakfast dish. We'd eat it with eggs and bacon.
Would there have been people feeding communities as well? So the fishermen would have sold it in
by pints.
By pints.
So Elvers were always sold around Gloucester in pints. You buy it by the pint. It would weigh about £1, yeah? But glass eels were sold by the pint.
Up to when?
Well, even in my lifetime. When I was sort of in my teens, I can remember glass eels being sold by the pint. I can remember being weighed in tin bars and pillowcases. I remember my father standing there endless hours washing glass eels, but you know, that's history.
History, because since the 1980s, Europe's eel population has experienced a devastating collapse, a decline of more than 90%. The Elvers caught along the Severn that night were not for eating or to be sold to farms to mature into adult eels for food. Instead, I was told their purpose was restocking, to end up in other European river systems where eel populations, unlike the Severns, have all but disappeared. Less than a mile away from the riverbank, inside a warehouse-like building on the side of an A-road, is a specialist facility where 1/2 ton of live glass eels caught from the Severn are being stored. Why is that alarm going off?
We have to have an alarm here to measure the oxygen levels and the temperature and the water flow. So, yeah, if the power goes off, then we've got to get down here in a hurry.
In rows of long open tanks, the fish are resting on the bottom. They look like a jumbled mass of tiny, transparent worms. The owner of this business near Gloucester, called UK Glass Eels, is Peter Wood, who's been in the Elver trade for decades. He's the only exporter of glass eels in the UK, and so when juvenile eels are fished out of the Severn, this is where they're taken. The number of Elvers in this room, how much would this be worth?
100,000.
Until Brexit and the UK's departure from the single market, Peter sold glass eels to eel farms and for restocking projects in European rivers in countries ranging from Greece to Germany and Hungary to the Netherlands, none of which is possible since Brexit. There's one destination he's found to send the eels to: Kaliningrad, in Russia. This is for conservation, not consumption, Peter says. A project that's adding glass eels to the depleted Vistula and Curonian lagoons.
The plan is that it will take some 8 to 12 years before there's sufficient to escape to the sea. Once we've reached that escapement target, it will be possible to harvest some of the fish in the lagoon.
But as you'll hear, there are as many twists and turns in this story as an eel's migration back to the Sargasso, as well as the historic catch of glass eels for food and the more recent supply of juveniles to eel farms and restocking programs. There's an illegal trade in glass eels worth billions of pounds. And you did hear correctly, billions of pounds.
They don't look like much, but these eels are as valuable to smugglers as cocaine.
Tourists at Madrid airport were caught with 48 live eels in their checked luggage, heading to China. They had these eels in special chilled suitcases.
Recent years have seen widespread unauthorized fishing as Elver prices soared. Riverside cameras set up by one commercial license holder have already spotted unauthorized harvesters this year.
When you look at the monetary returns on the illegal market, it's approaching one of the major wildlife crimes.
Concerns over this international illegal trade is the reason why the UK government recently placed an export ban on the 1/2 ton of glass eels caught from the Severn this spring. The fish Peter Wood was planning to send to Russia.
Tonight is the last night that this business is going to be open. It's finished. I mean, I find it very, very difficult to accept that this, and it really hasn't got home to me. But this is the last day that we will ever trade, and you ought to have a look at the glass eels, because you'll never see that. You'll never see that again.
DEFRA says Peter Wood's application for the export of glass eels to Kaliningrad was refused because of, and I'm quoting from a statement here, concerns of significant risks of illegal trading, compounded by the current situation in Russia. Peter's response is that he's convinced the eels are being used to restock the lagoon and that he stands to lose up to £30 million worth of business. And for the fishers on the Severn, such as Dave, if there's no longer a destination for the glass eels, they fear that generations of Elver fishing on the Severn could be coming to an end.
Why can't my sons enjoy this? In 20 years' time when I'm gone, I would like to think of them being down there saying, "Oh, Dad used to be down here catching this," and whatever. So it'd be such a shame if we do lose the fishery.
More on those controversial eels in a moment. This situation on the River Severn is just one of many stories around the world linked to the fate of the eel. The journey of the fish from abundance to endangered status has been rapid and relentless. Not only a victim of consumption and crime, but also of the catastrophic impact humans have had on rivers. Ecosystems we've plundered, polluted, and impaired in so many different ways. The case of the European eel with its 90% collapse is dramatic, but other species, including the Japanese and American eels, also face a precarious future. So what does the future hold for the eel? And should anyone be eating this fish? Before we attempt to answer those questions, we need someone to properly introduce us to the eel.
Hi there, I'm Randolph Feldtrop. I'm a principal fish specialist working at Natural England, and we're one of the advisors of the government in England.
And through years of fieldwork, Randolph has also been part of a team that's helping to solve some of the remaining mysteries of the eel's life cycle. As we've heard, spring is an important season in that life cycle, marking the arrival of juveniles into rivers. And so is autumn.
A lot of the adult eels, which are called yellow eels, start metamorphosing into something called silver eels, and that's when they get ready for their big migration to the Sargasso Sea, which is an area of sea off Bermuda. Their body changes, they get really dark across their backs, silver bellies, big pectoral fins, big eyes, and interestingly as well, they totally stop eating, and it's normally sort of the big thunderstorms and rains we get in the autumn that triggers this big sort of migration of silver eels, where they'll come down our rivers, swim into our estuaries, and then off into the ocean, never to be seen again.
I know this seems like a very basic question, Randolph, but I feel the need to ask, what is an eel?
An eel is a sort of a long, sort of thin anguillid fish. So globally there's about sort of 16 known species of anguillid or freshwater eels, and there's 3 subspecies, and they're generally sort of found all over the world, so in 150 different countries. They're mainly found in sort of tropical and temperate waters, except sort of the Eastern Pacific and South Atlantic. And yeah, one of the key things they all share is their life cycles are unique in that they're dependent on key habitats and habitat interconnectivity between sort of freshwater, estuarine and marine environments. What we know about the European eel makes it a truly amazing. So its journey to breed has long been considered one of the most impressive feats of animal migration observed in nature. One of the amazing things about the European eel is it's what's called a panmictic species, so all the eels in Europe are all one stock. So that means that eels found from Norway all the way to Morocco, and sort of Morocco's the southern limit of eels, they all belong to the same population, can be migrating from northern Norway, Italy, Morocco, and all these eels are migrating to the Sargasso Sea. Small male eels, big female eels, all swimming at different speeds with an aim of getting to the Sargasso Sea, which is an area of sea off Bermuda that's kilometres deep, to then find a mate and then die. So it's a pretty unique life cycle.
No one has ever seen eels in the Sargasso Sea or witnessed them breeding in the wild. But we do know from monitoring their offspring, the journey must begin in the Sargasso Sea.
When the juveniles hatch, the little sort of juvenile leptocephali, so they look a bit like, maybe like a willow leaf, so quite flat. They'll make their journey to Europe, which takes sort of 2 to 3 years drifting on ocean currents such as the Gulf Stream and the North Atlantic Drift. And then when they reach our European shores again, they come into our estuaries and they transform into something called glass eels, which is about sort of approximately 8 centimetres long, see-through worm shape, I guess. And that's then called a glass eel, and that's often sort of one of the life stages that they're exploited. So it's the small glass eels that fishermen historically used to fish for a lot in places like the River Parrett and the Severn estuary, and other big river systems in Europe, for direct consumption, but sort of in more recent decades for supplying aquaculture facilities for farming these on.
And it was 1 o'clock in the morning on the Severn that I saw the glass eels arrive along a moonlit stretch of the river.
There they are. A moving cluster.
Yeah.
They look browny, almost pink in some cases.
Yeah, so you got some nice bright pink with a red line down them. Like that one there.
Yeah.
And then you've got a little one like that.
They are.
So see the red one there.
See their eyes.
Yeah. The smaller ones are like that one there.
Yeah.
He's probably been in the system for a couple of months. Incredible, aren't they?
Beautiful things.
They are incredible.
Yeah.
According to the Environment Agency, which controls fishing on the Severn, 95 people were authorised to fish for Elvers in the Bristol Channel between February and April this year. One is Dave. For him, being on the river is about keeping a tradition alive, preserving knowledge and skills.
Normally we'd be out here till 4, 5 in the morning.
Yeah.
But of course, if I stayed here now, I just got to tip them back in. And that ain't going to help them.
The reason he says chucking them back in won't help them is because of what happens along the next stretch of the Severn. Weirs and locks block the glass eel's path further inland, and Dave is convinced most of the fish he'll release are doomed. Better, he believes, to take some out to be sent to river systems elsewhere, where they might stand a better chance of growing into adult eels and returning to the Sargasso Sea. To see what the eels are up against on one of the Severn's tributaries, I met Andrew Kerr, founder of the Sustainable Eel Group, the organisation which sets standards for commercial eel businesses across Europe.
Here we are walking along the banks of the River Frome towards Frome Bridge Mill. The River Frome flows from the Severn up towards Stroud and then into the Stroud valleys behind it. It's been an area of great wool and industry and mills, and so here we are looking at the mill.
There's been a mill on this site for 1,000 years, but it was in the 18th century that a 2-metre-high weir was built, a major obstacle for Elvers and eels.
The rivers gradually got more and more engineered. Water engineering for using mill power just got bigger and bigger, and then by the time we get into the Victorian times and heavy engineering, the rivers get dammed further and further and further. Today there are 1.3 million barriers to the rivers of Europe that affect the migration of eel.
And these are dams and weirs?
Dams, weirs, water pumps, hydropower stations, all forms of well-intentioned human engineering, but not having regard for the full consequences for the environment.
And what does this represent, this mill in Gloucestershire? What did they do here historically?
Well, this particular valley, the Frome Valley, was world famous for its cloth. What they did for the river is they made migration, the natural movement up the river and down the river, so much harder.
Around £30 million has been spent by the Environment Agency on passes along the Severn, channels that give the elvers and eels more of a chance of making it through the river system, including along the River Frome. It's not easy to monitor how effective they are, and changes to the wider landscape also present a serious problem for the eel. To create more agricultural land, wetlands have been drained, and so entire ecosystems that provided a nursery for the eels have disappeared in Britain and across the continent.
Now, something like 3/4 of all the wetlands of Europe have been drained. So the eel's natural habitat is already a fraction of what it once was. So it's draining wetlands, it's blocking the migration channel upstream, and then on the downstream run, it's blocking it again, but also with spinning turbines, it's chopping them up. But the life cycle for this river, this part of Europe, even today, they arrive in incredible abundance. It's 10% of what it was, but it's still 50 to 100 million glass eels coming up the Bristol Channel and entering the Severn estuary and the rivers that surround it. 50 years ago and 100 years ago, it would have been 1 billion. So it's 10% of what it was.
When glass eels arrived in their former numbers into European waters, it's possible they represented half of all the biomass in rivers. They were a keystone species on which so much other biodiversity depended: fish, birds and mammals, including humans.
For example, if we look at things like the Doomsday Book, there's more land rents paid in eels than any other currency. When we look back through sort of a lot of the names in the UK, a lot of them come back to eels. So, for example, Ely, up in the Fens, is named after eels, and Ely is one of the smallest cities, but it has the largest cathedral. And again, that cathedral was funded for and built for using eels. So again, when we look back at the history, we can just see the central importance that eels would have played culturally and economically as part of our society. And again, sort of even in more recent times, kind of its jellied eels is still within people's living memory.
What's your idea of a really good day out by the seaside?
Well, I hope the weather keeps fine, and paddle our feet in the sea, and nice space in the jellied eel.
From the BBC's archive, an eel-filled day trip to Brighton in 1958. And from 1965, an illustration of the eel's lost abundance, an annual eel-eating competition held in London in which competitors represented their local pub.
And who is the champion then?
Mr. Sammy Page, representing the Knight of Averley of South Ockenden.
How many bowls of eels did he eat last year?
26.
That seems a fantastic quantity.
It was a fantastic quantity.
In terms of eel, I mean, how much eel is that?
16 foot of eel.
Did you ever eat any yourself?
I can't stand them.
We know since the 1980s, I guess, sort of eel recruitment, that's the number of eels that we see coming back to our coast systems has declined by more than 95% since sort of the 1970s and the 80s. So it's been a very steep decline. And that's because we can monitor at key sites, we can monitor the amount of little glass eels that come back into our systems.
Systems we've engineered blocking a juvenile species we've caught to eat or export to be grown on in farms.
We exploit the juvenile elvers as they come into our rivers, and we exploit the adult yellow eels as they live in our river systems, and then we exploit the silver eels as they try to leave our river systems. So pretty much at every stage of their life cycle we exploit them, compared to a normal fishery where we would exploit mature adults. Its culinary delicacies in a lot of other countries is what's sort of potentially in part driven some of those declines as well.
Most eel farming and eel consumption takes place in East Asia, with China and Japan driving most demand. For an insight into why that is, over to Kimiko Barber, the food writer based in the UK, but originally from Kobe, the city in southern Japan.
The eel, we call it unagi, right? That's is really embedded in a Japanese food culture. There is a historic, sort of prehistoric evidence, archaeological evidence, that the Japanese been eating it for millennia.
Kimiko, what is the status of the eel in Japanese food culture today?
It's definitely a treat. You don't expect to see it on a family dinner table. People go to eel restaurant. I mean, the eel restaurant, they serve nothing but eels. And eels are sold live. They're still wiggling in a bucket, in a fish market. And it's also not for the faint-hearted. They are still swimming, they're alive, very lively. and sort of wiggling around and so forth. The eel restaurant chef will come in and say, okay, so fishmonger actually had to sort of grab hold of one of those, which is really wiggly and sort of slippery. It's quite a sight.
And reflecting how deep and complex eel culture is in Japan, I think there are important regional variations in the way they're prepared. What are they?
There is a food divide in Japan, east and west. East is actually around the Tokyo area. They don't like slicing open the tummy. So even for the prepping of fish, they go from the back. They fillet it from the back. They butterfly it. After filleting, they steam it. And then they grill it with a very sort of sweet, soya-based. It's a bit like a teriyaki sauce. And, sort of shiny. Whilst in Osaka area, they don't steam it. So it's still kind of, I should say chewy, a very meaty texture.
And are there times of the year when people are more likely to be eating eel?
Apparently, about nearly 50% of annual consumption is actually recorded on the day of Ox Day, of the sort of summer.
I think Ox Day is midsummer when it's very, very hot in Japan, and that's eel eating time.
Which is actually a bit of a myth, because eel tastes best in the autumn and winter, because they fatten themselves up, to overwinter. So the summer eel is actually quite lean.
And Kimiko, as you know, eel numbers around the world have been in decline, including in Asia. Is there much awareness in Japan of it being an endangered fish?
To be honest, probably less than here. And trying to tell Japanese stop eating eels or take it off the menu it's not going to happen. And, many jobs depends on eel trade. The old dichotomy or the argument between respect for the tradition and the sustainability argument, I don't know how to solve it, to be honest.
Kimiko Barber. No one has succeeded in breeding eels in captivity, and as we've heard, to meet demand across East Asia, glass eels are sourced from the wild around the world to be grown on in East Asian farms. As a protection measure, it's now illegal for Elvers and glass eels from the European Union to be exported to Asia. And in Europe, the trade is strictly controlled under something called Appendix 2 of CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species.
But despite that, a lot of sort of DNA barcoding of eel products around the world sort of reveals widespread mislabelling and illegal trade of endangered European and Japanese eel. There was a study published earlier this year which found that sort of 99% of eels consumed worldwide belong to sort of three threatened species: our European eel, the American eel, and the Japanese eel.
Randolph Eltrop of Natural England. As far back as the 1990s, when there were few controls on the catching and movement of eels from the UK and other parts of Europe, a pint or a pound of eels could easily fetch £300. And according to Undercurrent News, the specialist journal for the seafood sector, last year the price of a kilo of glass eels reached $15,000, sums that are driving the illegal trade. By value and by number, the glass eel is the victim of Europe's biggest wildlife crime. Helping to monitor this trade is the NGO Traffic. Their European director is Anastasia Timoshina.
A lot of what we know about illegal trade happens at the transport stage, because that's where frequently the seizures are happening, when something is being transported between the countries. Transport may take different forms, from fairly large shipments. It could be mixed in with other seafood, for instance, or live seafood, or even, and this is fairly common, personal luggage. So traffickers use oxygenated water bags just in the suitcases and go through the airports with those bags.
And these criminal networks are highly adaptable, so increased efforts by police in one part of the world, that can lead to new supply routes developing elsewhere.
In the last decade, let's say, from European airports, there has been a lot more seizures also in North Africa, West Africa, Canada. So the routes are evolving all the time to avoid detection of this illegally traded glass eels. At aquaculture facilities themselves, the mixing of legally and illegally sourced glass eels and Elvers does occur, and the species differentiation is pretty much impossible unless you're doing a DNA test. So visually, you cannot distinguish whether you see in front of you a glass eel of Japanese eel, American eel, European eel, or others. So the remaining of supply chain then becomes absolutely obscure and impossible to distinguish whether what is consumed later on is legal or illegal. European eels, in the space of very few decades, the population's reduced very significantly. And it is not to say that all of this happened because of overfishing. This is a very important point as well. European eel is a critically endangered species because of dams, because of habitat loss, because of pollution. But also illegal trade in glass eels clearly has produced a very significant threat to their survival.
And what is known about the scale of the illegal trade?
Some recent operations have been recovering several tons in a single season of harvesting of glass eels, which is a large quantity. But the law enforcement estimate that only about 10% of illegal trade is detected. So it gives us some idea about just how significant the trade is overall versus what has been seized. And much more recently, European policing organization Europol estimated that they seized about 22 tons of glass eels. So very large quantities. Glass eels trafficking is the biggest wildlife crime priority for most of the EU member states, in particular countries like Spain, Portugal, France, but also the UK. So Europol again estimates that in single season or single year, the financial crime impact of this trade is measured in billions of euros, which is extremely significant.
And with so much money involved and this being a trade in live animals, these networks must be extremely sophisticated.
Illegal glass eel operations are very specialized illicit businesses. So for one, fish needs to remain alive, healthy, and ensure integrity and profitability of aquaculture business itself. You do not want to bring in fish that has been sick into the aquaculture business, clearly. Being a very lucrative business, again, it allows traffickers and these criminal gangs to, recruit expertise they need. There is some evidence that there could be storage facilities, like underground storage facilities, close to the airports. So it's correct to describe this criminal networks as sophisticated and very well resourced. The kind of really big criminal networks that have been identified was through linkages to money laundering, to financial crime.
Anastasia Timoshina of the NGO Traffic. But what is the relevance of this international illegal trade to the half-ton of glass eels stored away and in limbo inside a warehouse in Gloucester? Back to Peter Wood of UK Glass Eels.
The first problem we had was Brexit. And now Brexit stopped all our exports to the EU. So we've looked for alternative markets, and we found an alternative market in Belarus and in Russia. And this market was to assist the recovery of the eel in the Vistula and Curonian lagoons. So this was a fantastic environmental project. We've got, I think it's 250,000 hectares of water to stock. It's been a tremendous task to organise stocking in Russia. I mean, just the logistics of getting there. We've helped the Russian team to set up a quarantine station. We've been seriously working on this project for the last 5 years when Brexit became a real threat. We started off with just a few hundred kilos, and now this year we were meant to send 2 tons for stocking in these 2 lagoons.
So from very little to today, how important has that Russian supply chain become?
This is absolutely crucial, because ironically we can't even stock our own waters in the UK, because Northern Ireland is now part of Europe. Loch Ness, which we used to stock, we used to send 2 tons there for stocking. I mean, that's stopped. So we've got this market in Russia.
Yeah.
I mean, they've had to invest in a quarantine station and a research program to maintain this stocking program. So what the false narrative is that this is not for stocking. This is not a stocking project. And the other part of it,
instead, it's what?
It's a program to supply eels for consumption. The Russians have produced a huge amount of documentation and reports as the program progresses. And then furthermore, the suggestion is that the glass eels have been purchased to support the war, that these glass eels that we send to Russia are then sold on to Asia.
3 years into the Russian restocking deal, which was initially approved by DEFRA and the Environment Agency, and which Peter says was worth up to £30 million across the 12 to 14-year lifespan of the project, the UK government imposed the current export ban. And this is what DEFRA told us. We have robust rules and laws in place to safeguard protected species, including glass eels, and any applications to export them are rigorously assessed to ensure they are legal and sustainable. The application for the export of glass eels was refused over concerns of significant risks of illegal trading, compounded by the current situation in Russia, by which it was referring to the war in Ukraine. Now, opposition to the Russian deal also came from the Sustainable Eel Group, which was set up more than a decade ago to introduce standards to the industry covering sourcing, traceability and conservation. So back to its chairman, Andrew Kerr.
This is a government decision made by the new government. We certainly encourage them to look at it because we have serious doubts about what we mean by restocking. The relevant minister from Kaliningrad said that they would catch them all within 5 or 6 years. And there are many other factors like that made us wonder whether this really was a conservation program, as is claimed, or whether it was a commercial program dressed up. And the government has investigated, and yes, they've made their decision. For SEG, it's particularly difficult because the EU, and we're a Brussels-based NGO, has no trade in eel to Russia, and we only support eel fishing where our standard is met. And the problem with a country like Russia is we can't assure the process. So even if they wanted to be certified, and they've never requested it, we couldn't send the assessment team to that country to carry out the necessary steps.
Why not?
It's against the EU law. Professions are not allowed to operate in Russia.
Is that post-Ukraine
it's
invasion?
all linked to the Ukraine drama.
Right.
So we wouldn't be able to assure it, therefore we couldn't, even if we wanted to, we couldn't certify it.
A petition against the trade from Gloucestershire to Russia was also signed by 40,000 people. A petition instigated by former eel fisherman Richard Fleming.
I started off simply thinking it was an endangered species, a critically endangered species. Why were we exporting it to a country that we were pretty much at war with, by proxy at least, after they invaded Ukraine? It was pretty much contemporary with the invasion of Ukraine. Why were we doing that? And was Russia a reasonable place to be exporting an endangered species to? I mean, as far as the person who was exporting the eels, I had no beef with him at all. I saw him as a businessman doing what businessmen do, doing what he'd been doing for 40 years. I hadn't a problem with him per se, but I did think that the way that the trade had been facilitated by DEFRA was quite questionable. If you can't verify what's going on with these endangered creatures, you should not be sending them.
Peter Wood has submitted a fresh application to DEFRA to send the eels to Russia, still convinced he's participating in a restocking project and not an illegal supply chain to East Asian eel farms. I'm sure we'll be returning to this story in future to explain what happens next. Meanwhile, there are big political events on the horizon, all with the potential to influence the future of the eel. In a few weeks' time, fishing quotas for glass eels will be set in Europe. Scientists have long been calling for these to be reduced. Around the same time, in Uzbekistan, more than 150 governments will gather for a COP meeting that will focus on the trade in wild species. This has the potential to give more eel species further protection under CITES, further limiting their trade around the world. And there are also calls to reduce consumption. Relais and Chateau, the association of more than 500 restaurants, including some of the world's most influential chefs, is supporting calls for a ban on all eel fishing until stocks recover, and for the fish to be taken off menus. One of the chefs involved is Michael Cimarusti of the Relais and Chateau restaurant Providence in Los Angeles.
Giving up eel is not a very difficult decision to make. And I do think that chefs are ambassadors for food. Chefs have the ear of the public. And we do shape food trends and what people choose to eat or choose not to eat. And I think in this particular instance, I'm more than happy to use my voice and my platform to stand in defense of eel. There's just no point in driving a species like that to extinction because we don't need it. No one's going to go hungry if they give up the eel.
It's possible to reflect on human behaviour through the lens of the eel, on our actions out at sea, along the world's rivers, and also at the table. It's complicated and truly global, but it is possible to help this unique and incredible fish to recover. That's why we all need to know its story.